Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the 2022 Suicide Prevention Summit. It's Pedro here, Mental Health Academy's CEO and your host for this event. And joining me for this session is Bronwen Edwards from Roses in the Ocean. Bronwen, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm well, Pedro. Lovely to be here again. Thank you.
It's always lovely to host you too. And for those of you that do not know Bronwen, which you'd be surprised by now with all the advocacy she's been doing over the last years, but you may not know her. So let's give you a little bit of a background. So Bronwen Edwards is the CEO of Roses in the Ocean, Australia's national lived experience of suicide organization, providing innovative, highly collaborative leadership within the suicide prevention sector for people with lived experience of suicide, communities, sector organizations, and government. As the driving force behind the National Safe Spaces Network, Roses in the Ocean have been working with the communities over recent years to co-design safe spaces and peer-enhanced services, including their community-managed and led pop-up safe places. Their Peer Care Connect service provides a national lived experience of suicide warm line and in-community suicide prevention peer workforce services. Bronwen holds a variety of state and national advisory positions, to which she first and foremost brings her personal lived experience of suicide to the table, while also striving to honor the vast perspectives of others she has been privileged to work with and walk alongside over many years. Bronwen is also the co-chair of the International Association of Suicide Prevention's Special Interest Group, Lived Experience. Bronwen, did I miss anything? Anything else you'd like to add?
No, not at all. It's embarrassing having long intros, isn't it?
I wouldn't call that long. I could probably keep talking about you for a little bit longer. All right. So before we jump into the slides, a quick reminder of the things you can and can't do as an attendee for this session. So you notice you can't talk, but you can use the chat function to interact with other participants, to drop some questions there for a Q&A at the end as well, or request support for our team if you need to. Secondly, is this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording as well as the slides will be available after the presentation via the event portal. So just keep an eye on it and refresh the page if you can't see yet. Now, Bronwen, enough of me. I am going to launch the slides and we'll be back here for our Q&A segment. Looking very much forward to it.
Lovely. Thanks, Pedro. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you here today, here to talk about the emerging suicide prevention workforce, peer workforce, and really looking to explore some of the opportunities for both paid and volunteer roles in that space. So look, first of all, though, and most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we're all collectively meeting and joining from today. I'm here in Brisbane, so I'm on Turrbal and Yuggera people's land, and would like to pay my respects to the people and their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge, of course, people with a lived experience of suicide. Many of you will be here on this session today will have a lived experience of suicide, and I acknowledge you for being here with us today, and thank you for all that you are personally doing. So I'd like to acknowledge those who have considered ending their life and those who have attempted to do so. Also acknowledge those who care for loved ones through suicidal crisis and people who've been bereaved through suicide. Also acknowledge all the lives that we've lost to suicide, and for those who are struggling today, and thank you for choosing life. Really important to acknowledge that everybody's lived experience is as unique as they are as a person. Everyone's lived experience is incredibly valuable, and everyone's lived experience can really make a difference. And I think it's incredibly exciting times here in Australia where people with lived experience are absolutely making a difference and are in fact leading the way in terms of what needs to happen in suicide prevention. So today was really wanting to just explore a bit with everybody just this whole concept of the suicide prevention peer workforce and what opportunities exist in front of us. So there's no doubt that there's a really pressing need for an ongoing expansion of a very specialised suicide prevention peer workforce. When you look at all of the different developments, the innovative services that are starting to emerge in our communities, they need a workforce within them. And we'll talk in more detail around some of the real nuanced needs that our suicide prevention peer workforce is looking to meet. So looking at also those various opportunities for both paid and volunteer roles. And I'm very aware that this can be quite a polarising topic, especially when we look at all the work that has happened in the history of the mental health peer workforce space, where they have really had to advocate incredibly hard to be recognised and valued and paid for the incredible work that they do. The concept of actually considering volunteers in that space can be quite challenging. So really wanting to unpack that a bit today and just utilise a couple of overseas and homegrown examples along the way. So first of all, I guess just to set the context, Roses in the Ocean defines lived experience as a person who's experienced suicidal thoughts or survived a suicide attempt, maybe someone who's cared for a loved one through suicidal crisis, or someone who's been bereaved by suicide. It was wonderful. I managed to tune in to the majority of Sarah's presentation just before the break. And it was really wonderful to hear her talking about and really emphasising the importance of that diversity of lived experience. And I know Sarah was talking more broadly and in terms of research as well, but it absolutely applies to the suicide prevention peer workforce as well. That ability to peer match such that the person who is walking alongside you has a lived experience very similar to what you're going through is incredibly powerful. So this definition is one that's been adopted here in Australia by Suicide Prevention Australia, as well as the International Association for Suicide Prevention, and has been cited by the World Health Organization. And I think when I reflect back over the last 11 years of Roses in the Ocean and our involvement in this space, I think one of the most key points to, I guess, the way in which the lived experience of suicide movement has developed really quite rapidly over the last decade. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that there is just this enormous respect and value given to the different perspectives within the lived experience of suicide. Groups of people come together from all different perspectives of suicide, but also so many different perspectives of underlying contributing factors and intersectional life events. And there's just there's this massive family and this absolute recognition that everybody's experience actually matters and everyone's experience is needed in order to really change the way that suicide prevention is approached and imagined in Australia. So I think there's real power in this very collective and diverse definition and the way that the lived experience of suicide prevention space has evolved. So let's just have a look at the suicide prevention peer workforce. And I really believe there's a very strong case for a very specialised suicide prevention peer workforce. Obviously, there's been the mental health peer workforce has been established for a number of decades, and they have done incredible work and really set this very important foundation for other peer workforces. I know in the most recent budget, there's been investment made into the eating disorders peer workforce. And I think it's really important for us to consider, just as you do in mental health services in terms of, not mental health services. If you look into our medical system our doctors specialise. They become GPs or they become orthopaedic surgeons or they become heart experts or brain surgeons. In our lawyers specialise, our engineers specialise. So in lots of professions, there are specialties under an overarching umbrella. And I think it's really important that we look at our peer workforce in the same way, and that there is a role for a mental health peer workforce, a suicide prevention peer workforce, an eating disorder and alcohol and other drugs, cancer, all sorts of different things. It's all about being able to have someone who has walked in very similar shoes to you to be able to be providing that really valuable peer support. And so it's our national policy agenda now strongly positions this lived experience of suicide at the front and centre of all suicide prevention system reform including the peer workforce. So I just wanted to visit very quickly just some of that environment, that landscape that we're now operating in, which is going to support this development of this workforce that is so needed. So if you, the shifting the focus, I'm sure most of you will be very aware of these documents. So this is the work of Christine Morgan, who's the Suicide Prevention Advisor to the Prime Minister, and her task force, who worked together over a couple of years, and this is their final advice. Now, there are 4 key enablers around this shifting the focus document. You'll see the 4th one there is all around workforce and community capability. And when you delve into that a little further, it talks about the establishment of the National Suicide Prevention Office, which of course has been established. There's members of that team already there, and the Executive Director announced fairly recently. And one of the first jobs of that National Suicide Prevention Office is actually to develop a national suicide prevention workforce strategy. I think that's an incredibly important advancement in where we're coming from, and an acknowledgement that this very specialised peer workforce is needed. Of course, that shifting the focus was built upon the first document that the task force and Christine Morgan released, which was the Compassion First document, which was developed through the consultation and engagement and research with 3,000 plus people with lived experience of suicide. And Sarah Wayland in the session before mentioned that she and Miff Maple were involved in some of the research that contributed to this report. You'll see there it identified some real clear opportunities for change. One of them there that is circled there down in that 5th point is around new community-based service models that align with a compassionate response, including safe spaces and peer-led services. That points directly to the need for a suicide prevention peer workforce. Again, develop and support the broad range of workforces involved directly and indirectly in suicide prevention to respond with compassion to underlying distress. So it's acknowledging that there is a range of workforces that need to be involved, need to be made available to people in order to be really providing the compassionate care that people with lived experience are asking for. Now, these numbers are by no means a surprise to any of you. We know this. I guess what I'm just wanting to highlight here is that with our current suicide rate, we tragically in 2020 lost 3,139 people to suicide. Now, the latest research has indicated that for each person that loses their life to suicide, up to 135 people are affected by that. Some, of course, incredibly impacted, those people closest to those, but there's a whole range of people that are affected by those suicides within the community. Some quick maths, over 423,000 people impacted every year. And of course, that doesn't just stop after 12 months. And so within our country, we have this cumulative effect of the number of people that are really impacted by suicide every year. Now, we add on to that a very old statistic and an estimate at that, but it's the only one that we have to work on really, is that it's accepted that there is at least 65,000 plus suicide attempts every year. So when you think about the scale of people who are requiring support and compassionate care, there is a lot of opportunity for this suicide prevention peer workforce. So within the health system, for example, and look, this is by far is not an exhaustive list, but it's just to give it a few examples, I guess, of where opportunities lie. Within our actual health system, which of course will always have some people come to them in distress. We know that a lot of people don't want to go into our emergency departments and what have you, but there always will be people. And so we have to make sure that those people who do enter to the health system in suicidal crisis or severe emotional distress, that it is a no wrong door, that they are met with a compassionate workforce, and that they have the opportunity to connect with peer workforce in those environments as well. So there's great opportunity to have suicide prevention peer workers embedded within every emergency department, within our hospital wards. The social prescribing that has been definitely in place for a long time in some other health sectors. There's much more talk now around how can we do social prescribing really well in the mental health and suicide prevention space. Imagine having suicide prevention peer workers really linked in closely with every GP practice. Blended workforces and mainstream services as well, another fantastic opportunity. So we have suicide prevention outreach teams starting to emerge, certainly in New South Wales over the last couple of years in their Towards Zero Suicides initiatives, where we have clinicians and suicide prevention peer workers actually going out and meeting people in their homes or wherever they are needing that support. Co-responder models have been trialled in numerous places around the country where, to my knowledge, they've been primarily with your first responder with a mental health clinician. They've having fantastic results in that. Let's take it another step forward and actually have suicide prevention peer workers accompanying first responders. So going out with police if they are called, ambulance if they are asked to come to someone's aid. So crisis support rooms within hospitals and near EDs. Once again, this is for those people who do find themselves in ED. Let's make sure that there are appropriate places for them to be in an appropriate environment, be supported by peer workers whilst they've entered into that particular space. There's been a lot of movement, which is fantastic to see, around Tier 3 safe spaces. The vast majority in the country at the moment are being run by either local health districts, excuse me, or mental health organisations. Wonderful opportunity once again to have suicide prevention peer workers working in those spaces, predominantly peer-led. Those Tier 3 models often have a clinical component to them. And then, of course, our aftercare services. The Wayback service is the Wayback support service that Beyond Blue model. Obviously, that's quite extensive around the country, and they've had a peer enhanced model piloted and now ongoing in one of their services. And I know there are other aftercare models as well. So the opportunity to really bring that peer workforce into that aftercare space would be absolutely fantastic and needs to happen, yesterday. Then you look at the peer-only services that are really starting to emerge. And of course, it's no surprise that we've been really pushing for these for quite some time. But so we have the non-clinical, the really purely non-clinical Tier 4 safe spaces that are community-led, suicide prevention peer work staffed, support groups like Eclipse, like the Shelter Group in Illawarra Shoalhaven, like the Alternatives to Suicide. Those support groups are really getting some fantastic traction, and they are peer-led. We need more of them. Proactive outreach into homes. So whilst we've got some suicide prevention outreach teams, that's fantastic. People are asking for so much more support in their homes without having to be taken somewhere else. And let's start thinking a bit more laterally. It's not just people in crisis that could really do with some peer support. Think about all the carers, think about the people who are bereaved, think about all these other people who are impacted by suicide that could really benefit by a suicide prevention peer workforce being able to actually contribute to supporting these people. Carer support and respite and bereavement support, as I've just mentioned. So I just think, and as I said at the beginning, this won't be exhaustive. There'll be people here online that will absolutely have other ideas, and there's certainly more places where peer workers could be really enhancing the experience for people as they access all sorts of different services. And I think when you then expand that out to having a look at all the different social determinants that contribute to somebody's distress or crisis, there are endless opportunities for us to be getting really early on some great peer support at all different touch points in people's lives to try to prevent people from becoming far more distressed and actually find themselves considering ending their lives. So let's just go back to these figures again. So we looked at the first 4 lines there, then consider when we add in potentially the 2.1 million people experiencing suicidal thoughts. Now, I just wanted to, sorry, I'm just going to find my note here because I want to give you where that has come from. That statistic is from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. It's the most recent I could find, and it's back in 2007. But it just gives us a bit of an indication, I guess, of just the vastness of people within our communities. At that time, it was 13% of Australians aged between 16 and 85 had serious thoughts about taking their own life at some point in their lives. Add on to that the hundreds of thousands of people who are caring for people they love and care about, who are thinking about suicide who are in crisis. So once again, I'm just trying to make the point in that there are so many people that could benefit from a suicide prevention peer workforce. And I guess where that leads me is I can't see a world in which any government, be it here in Australia or anywhere else, is actually going to have enough money to be able to fund a fully paid peer workforce if we want to be providing support for all of these people. So I absolutely hear Sarah in her presentation previously before the break, absolutely hear her and support her, and it's something that Rose in the Ocean has always advocated for and led by example, I would think, in terms of people with lived experience of suicide, when they are contributing, that they absolutely deserve to be remunerated for what they do. There's no question about that. And they need to be remunerated as the experts as they are, not by a tokenistic gift card and what have you, as Sarah was talking about. I'd like to take, I guess, just to separate that to when we're talking peer workforce. I absolutely believe we need a widespread national paid suicide prevention peer workforce. There is no doubt about that. And there are so many roles where those people are needed. My point around the volunteer space is that if we can't have a large enough, expansive enough paid suicide prevention peer workforce, I believe there is absolutely the appetite, and we're seeing this in some trials that we've done, absolutely an appetite for a volunteer suicide prevention peer workforce to work alongside, staffed by people who simply want to provide a few hours of their time every month in contributing back. And we often have, in the last 11 years with Rose in the Ocean, many, many times there's been people that we have paid or offered payment for who actually won't accept it or give it back because they simply want to do it as a volunteer. And that, of course, is their right to choose to do that. So let's just have a look at volunteering in Australia and the benefits of volunteering. And because what we are at Rose in the Ocean are doing we have been piloting a couple of different services using volunteers, utilising the expertise of volunteers with lived experience of suicide. And if we just sort of step back out of the suicide prevention space for a moment to look at volunteering in general, and I went to sort of Volunteering Australia just to get some of the more recent statistics and what have you. But in terms of benefits of volunteering, it's pretty widely researched and accepted that volunteers benefit their communities. There's no doubt about that. They provide important services to other community members. By volunteering, it means you get this wonderful diversity of insights that are brought to the table. Volunteers increase efficiencies, they improve effectiveness, and they have been linked to improving the economic and the health of a country. But we also know that volunteers benefit personally through expanding their own personal networks. It gets people out and about and doing something and outwardly focused. We see from various researchers that it helps in reducing anxiety. It can actually increase people's professional skills. So some people like to start in a volunteer capacity and it then actually helps them go into a paid capacity as well. And it serves as an indicator of well-being and social cohesion. So there's lots of benefits for both community and the individual in volunteering. So 3 in 10 people who are 15 years or older are volunteers in Australia, and almost one third of Australians aged 15 or over are in unpaid voluntary work. And there seems to be a fairly even gender distribution. In terms of age groups, the most recent stats that I've been able to find was from 2019. So the people most likely to have participated in unpaid voluntary work through an organisation are either in that 40 to 54 bracket or 55 to 69, and the 15 to 24. So fairly large expanse of that age population there. And in terms of the time that they contribute, 30% of people contributed between 21 and 99 hours in a year, and 28% of people contributed 100 or more hours. And that volunteers have contributed an estimated 596 million hours to the community in a 12-month period. When we look at the type of organisations that people are volunteering in, you can see here I've just circled a few that are sort of related to the suicide prevention space. So community and ethnic groups, we've got emergency services there, and health and welfare. If we look then at type of volunteering activity, if we look down here at the befriending, supportive listening, counselling and mentoring, you've got 10%. The reasons for being a volunteer, in the top 4, I think they are, not quite, top 5, you've got personal satisfaction, people wanting to do something that's really worthwhile, helping others or helping community, personal and family involvement, and social contact. So the reasons that people are coming to the volunteering space, I think once again, lends itself very well to that volunteering opportunity within the suicide prevention space as well. And I just also wanted to highlight that in the recommendation 22 from the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention final report. So it is that the committee recommends, this is from the select committee. So there was a select committee on mental health and suicide prevention, and the government formally acknowledging the value of the volunteer mental health workforce. And Volunteering Australia is recommending that the role of volunteering be made explicit and advanced as an integral part of the implementation strategies emerging from various inquiries. So it seems to me that there is not only the national policy landscape that is supporting both a peer workforce but also a volunteering component of that, but just the history of volunteering itself and the reasons why people get involved and the amount of time that people tend to contribute to that space, I think puts us in quite a good position to be considering this very seriously in the suicide prevention sphere. If we take Lifeline, for example, it's Australia's largest suicide prevention organisation. They have 10,000 volunteers and they have 1,000 employees. So everyone on the Lifeline number is actually a volunteer. So it has been done, and it's been done incredibly well. So in terms of why I think it's so critical to suicide prevention, obviously I've mentioned, there is a growing demand for services that traditionally rely heavily on staff. And so there's this real demand for non-clinical alternatives and choices. And in areas such as community and aged care and disability services, they have done and continue to rely very heavily on volunteers. People with lived experience of suicide are really asking for those alternatives, those choices and options. And if we're truly going to have a community where everyone has somewhere that they're happy to go, we've got to provide everything on the continuum, from clinical services that are informed and compassionate and can offer an enhanced service with peers as well. The ones in the middle road where there's a full workforce of both clinicians and peer workers, and then those other services that are purely non-clinical and peer-led. I don't, as I mentioned before, I really can't see a time when government will be in a position to fund as many of those services as we'd all love to see. So if you're looking at safe spaces, people in crisis don't want to have to drive half an hour to get to a safe space. For those to be genuine options, we need to have hundreds and hundreds of them around the country. Peer matching is incredibly powerful, and it requires a really large pool of people to draw from. So when I talk about peer matching, it is about, at its simplest form, you'd say when you only had a small pool, you'd say, right, if someone is in crisis, then they ultimately want to be supported by someone who's been in crisis themselves. If someone's bereaved, then being able to provide them with a peer worker who has been bereaved by suicide is going to be offer them an enormous connection that won't necessarily come from someone who hasn't been bereaved by suicide. But then you can actually dig much deeper into there and say, well, if I'm a carer of someone who's in crisis, if I'm a mum who's got a child who's in crisis, I would really love to speak to another parent who knows what it's like to support a child in crisis. If I'm supporting my husband in crisis, I'd like to speak to someone who's got that sort of experience. If I've made an attempt on my life and it's coming up to the anniversary of that, I'd really like to talk to someone who's made an attempt on their life before. So the peer matching, in order to do that really well, then we need to have a much greater pool. Also, if you're somebody from a particular cultural background and you'd really like to be able to have a peer worker who understands your cultural background, who's from the same background and understands the different challenges and barriers that you face, that pool needs to expand. So the sheer numbers of people in crisis and making attempts, caring for loved ones, people bereaved, I think really points to the need for this dual suicide prevention peer workforce. Some overseas examples, I've just pulled a couple out here where volunteer models have been really long established within the suicide prevention field. Maytree House is one of them in the UK. It's a 4-night, 5-day residential stay for people in crisis. They have volunteer befrienders, and that term befriending is around someone who's got a similar lived experience and is able to connect with them either over the phone or face-to-face and just be that peer support. The volunteer befrienders are asked to sign up for 4 hours per week plus 1 overnight shift with a 12-month minimum commitment. All of the volunteers that are at Maytree now are actually previous guests of the house. It's 22 years now in its existence, and so just fantastic to see that everyone who's there now volunteering actually came to the house at some point themselves. They only actually have 5 paid staff, and they're in the management and finance and fundraising space. I don't know whether those people have a lived experience of suicide or not. And they are now looking to open a second house in Manchester. The other example was actually a service that I first found out about recently at the World Congress, and there was a presentation made around the Impact Suicide Prevention Centre in Arizona, and it's a suicide bereavement support group program that they specifically spoke about. They do a lot of other things, and they have 29 volunteers leading survivors of suicide support groups, both in person and virtually. And they've been going for 33 years, and they say that their volunteers are their greatest resource. So just a couple of examples in different sort of areas of suicide prevention. If we have a look at the critical success factors for the suicide prevention peer workforce, I think it's exceptionally really important, as I've talked about already, around recognising the importance and the power of peer matching. The investing in specialised peer workforces, so absolutely acknowledging the mental health peer workforce still needs to grow and what have you, but we do need these other peer workforces as well. really important that we actually spend time supporting the organisations that are going to integrate and partner with peer workforces as well. So providing training and support to whole of organisations, their teams and their managers, to really help them understand the value of peer work, what peer workers bring to the table, the expertise that they bring, and to really value and respect that, and to help them actually all come together and work together. It has been in the past, we've heard many stories from peer workers, predominantly in the mental health space, because that's where they've been. But, many have spoken about them being the ones who get to empty the rubbish bin and makes the cups of tea. It doesn't always happen like that, of course. I know there are some peer workers that are absolutely engaged more now and really working as equals, but they do need to work as equals. They bring a very unique set of expertise that is just as valuable as anyone else's. So it's important to deliver that very contextualised training for each specialty area. So there's some great base training in peer work, in your Cert 4 or your intentional peer support. But in each individual, if you're going to have specialised peer workforces, we need contextualised, specialised training that can really talk to what's it like to bring your lived experience of suicide into a suicide prevention service supporting people with the same lived experiences you've got. It's different, and there are things that need to be developed and explored in those different contexts. It's very important as well, I think, really critical that there is external peer mentoring and professional development provided. What we have learned ourselves and what we hear from out of the mental health peer workforce too is that most of the time the challenges that peer workers have had in the past has not been about their lived experience and has not been about supporting people. It has actually been about having to work within organisations that don't quite understand peer work. And so it's incredibly important that they have the opportunity to work with someone external to their employer who can help them navigate those sorts of discussions, conversations that need to be had, and develop them professionally to be able to go back into that environment and really continue to be that catalyst of change and support that working environment that they're in. And we need to build on the peer workforces that have come before. We really must look to the wonderful work that's been done in the mental health peer workforce space and learn from it and coexist and just continue to learn and grow together. So I think that from our perspective are some of the really critical success factors that we need to be considering. So once again, in terms of we've talked a lot about the volunteers and the case for it. And in terms of the actual paid suicide prevention peer workforce, this is just an overview of some of the work that Rose in the Ocean's been developing for a number of years around that organisational readiness, or really understanding and valuing peer work, but also providing support for actually recruiting suicide prevention peer workers, helping to write position descriptions, helping on interview panels, referencing, really providing resources to help organisations get it right and get the right people in for the right roles that they're looking for. And then it is about that very specialised training. It's wonderful now to see we've got in your safe spaces and in your blended workforces, in terms of your SPOT teams, we've got people who are lived experience of suicidal crisis in a position to support people in crisis. So there's specialised training for them. But then you've got the likes of standby support after suicide who have introduced peers into their model. And so that training needed to be adapted such that you could have the right context for people who are bereaved by suicide, supporting people who are bereaved. There's also a SP peer worker carer that's partway through co-design, and there's an SP peer worker for youth, which has been specifically developed for New Horizons, a youth aftercare service. So really recognising the need to be very specialised in the training that people are given, in addition to that foundational training. And then, of course, that wraparound support in terms of peer mentoring, group co-reflection, and that community of practice. And I know somebody mentioned in the previous session as well with Sarah asking, are there forums where people with lived experience can connect and speak with each other and what have you? On a national, Pedro just asked me to sort of talk to this if I could. On a broad national level, at this point in time, to my knowledge, no. Within Roses in the Ocean has a lived experience collective of anyone who we have trained, and there is a Facebook page in which they're able to interact. We are developing a suicide prevention peer workforce portal on our website, which will be available in the next few months for people who are suicide prevention peer workers. And we're also working towards pulling together a community of practice of people who are bringing their lived experience of suicide into designated lived experience roles. So it's absolutely, I think there's a real need for it. And yeah, there are some things on the horizon. But I know that there will be other groups like Leyland down in South Australia. I'm sure they will have people that are involved with them. There is most likely an opportunity there for them to connect, and there will be others, I'm sure, around the country. But in terms of one particular national one, I'm not aware of one. I've already covered that, so I'll just skip right across that. So I just very quickly, before I finish, I've ended up talking more than I thought I would. Just a couple of things that we've been piloting over the last few months, and really piloting the volunteer suicide prevention peer workforce. So the first one is the SP Peer Care Connect. Two components. One is the National Warm Line, and one is an in-community model. So the National Warm Line's been up and running for about 12 months. It's a callback service. We absolutely try and peer match as best as we can. We have received budget funding 12 months, 15 months ago, and when that comes, that will enable us to expand our pool of peer care companions significantly so that our peer matching will be able to be even more specific. People can call as often as they like. It's not a crisis line. It's an opportunity to connect with another person with a lived experience of suicide similar to yours and just have a conversation. The Peer Care Connecting community is actually being trialled in Western Australia in the Peel and Rockingham area, the Park region, and it's providing a small pool of volunteer peer care companions who are providing face-to-face and virtual peer support, specifically predominantly in the bereavement space. So we're providing additional complementary and supplementary support to the standby service and the ARBA service there. But there's also been a little bit of support into the aftercare space as well. And we're looking to scale that into 4 regions over the next 3 years. And that will actually be presented at the EAS Asia Pacific Conference by Sam Phipps, who heads that particular service up in WA. But what we have been learning is that there is so much need for additional support beyond what services are able to provide in many cases. And so these peer care companions can work in conjunction with existing services and come in and just provide A, that peer support, but B, that additional number of touch points and connections that can be made that these services just do not have time for. The peer care companions are provided with specific training, peer care companion training, as well as Living Works Assist. We have a paid warm line coordinator who has a lived experience of suicide, of course. They attend monthly meetings, including ongoing skill development. And we are actually improving, getting a much more sophisticated telephony system and a volunteer management software to be implemented later this year as we scale this program. And the next step is to actually develop our Friends of Peer Care Connect program, which also talks to that absolute necessity of making sure that when people are just so generous with their time and are volunteering themselves and their lived experience into these types of roles, that they are fully supported emotionally and professionally, but also financially, so that they're never out of pocket for travelling to somewhere or that cup of coffee or whatever it is that they're doing as a volunteer, that is always covered and they're never having to put their hand in their own pocket. So we basically really believe, as I said there, that through mobilising an army of trained and supported people with lived experience of suicide, Peer Care Connect is really able to provide that additional connection and that real mutual understanding that comes when, you know, you're connected before you connect, because you have walked, you know, that similar path to somebody else. The other pilot that we have been undergoing is our community-led, community co-designed, volunteer peer staffed safe spaces. So these are the genuine Tier 4 safe spaces. We have community safe space, but also the pop-up safe space. So a community safe space will be one that is in the same place, same times each week, and people know that it's always there. The pop-ups may be something where that same team of people, or it may be a different team of peers, but they may go and be at the Saturday markets, or they might turn up at a university for a particular orientation week or whatever, but it's a pop-up in the true sense of the word. And we will be, we've got 5 pilots at the moment in Busselton in WA, Castlemaine, Victoria, Brisbane Bayside in Queensland, and then 2 in New South Wales in Northern Beaches and Inner West. And we will be delivering another 15 of these over the next few years. This is your pure volunteer model, and it is completely community co-designed, community managed, and community led. So we're very excited about this, and we think this is a wonderful avenue for people who do wish to volunteer some time and bring their lived experience to these spaces, that it's just an invaluable way to support other people. So in terms of that sustainability of the peer workforce, I think recruitment is incredibly important, and an ongoing recruitment. So you're constantly going to be needing to adding to that pool. It increases our diversity, and it increases just the ability for people to step in and step out when they want to as well. We need to support that organisational culture change, those individual paradigm shifts. You know, it's hard for people to get their heads around sometimes when they've come from a completely clinical background and they've really believed that that's the only way, and now they're learning that actually there's another way of doing things. And we need to support that transition. We need to support services to really integrate and connect. That ongoing professional development, as I've said, really respecting and valuing expertise. In our paid suicide prevention peer workforce, those salaries must recognise the expertise that is brought to the table. We need to actively support all of our peer workers in their self-care. We need to create career pathways for people. We need to provide that professional mentoring and really encourage that genuine integration with other services. And then I think there's a real role here that is untapped at the moment in partnerships with organisations, businesses, government, to provide a whole range of resources to wrap around a volunteer workforce, so that they really can do their work without, as I said before, having to dip into their own pockets at any point in time. There's just a few resources, and they'll be on the slides. There's a few of the references and what have you that I've used throughout today, but I will finally stop talking, Pedro, and come back to you.
Not finally, but that was great. Thank you very much, Bronwen, and I'm very glad your sister with us as well. That's better.
That's better.
There we go. All right, everyone, we're back here for our Q&A. So if you have submitted questions, we will try to cover them. If you haven't yet, use the chat function, the Q&A option, to submit your questions. Thank you very much, Bronwen. That was a great session. Now, let me start with the questions that are already here. So the first one is from Paul, and the question is, in the shift of focus towards lived experience, are there any moves to introduce learning subjects into graduate and postgraduate university subjects within counselling, social work, and psychological degrees?
I wish there were. I guess my main answer is it is a really big area of focus for us, in terms of we absolutely acknowledge that we need to get into tertiary education in a really large way, such that our counsellors, social workers, our GPs, our psychologists, our psychiatrists, everybody is actually lived experience informed and is suicide literate. And we'd like it to be lived experience informed, suicide literate. I think it's happening in pockets, in very small pockets. Here in Brisbane, for example, year before, it's hard with COVID, it all blurs into the same years. But I was invited to go and do an hour's lecture to a group of year 3 or 4 med students. It was the only suicide prevention training they were getting. And I think that's fairly common in a lot of the spaces. So it's an area that needs a lot more work. I'm not to say it's not happening in small pockets, but I think it's one of the next big places that we have to really infiltrate very soon.
Thanks, Brian. I'm interested in your thoughts about obviously with lived experience, it's very important to look at it from an integrative perspective. You want to integrate the lived experience into everything else that's been happening, and also change some of the things that the way they were done through the infusion of lived experience. I do find that sometimes when there is talk about the lived experience, some advocates seem to have more of a binary view that you either have the medical model or you have lived experience, and it's either one or the other, and they can be quite critical sometimes of standard psychological research versus lived experience. So have you come much across that, and when you do, how do you kind of manage that conversation and try to kind of explain what the purpose of lived experience is?
Yeah, Pedro, it's a really good question, and I think yes, look, there's a whole continuum. I think we still do have people who really do feel that suicide prevention is a mental illness and it can only be treated by clinical services. But I'm really pleased to say that I really think that is shifting significantly. And at the other end, there will be some who will think that it should all just be lived experience. I really do believe that it is an and, not an or. There will always be people who want or need, or both, clinical services. What we've got to make sure is that they are lived experience informed and that, in my opinion, peer enhanced, such that anywhere that they go, be it into an emergency department, into a counsellor, a GP, a psychologist, a safe space, have somebody come to their house with an ambo, all of those people, that they all need to be no wrong doors. So they all have to ensure that that person gets incredibly compassionate, supportive, helpful help, and that they choose what happens to them. So I think the way I have explained it, because we do have clinicians, particularly in all the co-design we've done recently around safe spaces, we've had lots of clinicians involved, and they've needed to be involved, and various people when you're developing safe spaces in that tier 3 space where they're going to be run by a hospital or a mental health service. The way I've explained it is, I've had clinicians say to me, but we're really compassionate people and we give care. And it's like, well, I don't doubt that you do. But the way I sort of see it is, you've got this pond and that's your clinical pond and that's where you work. And now there's this pond that exists that has clinicians and peer workers, and you're working in that as well. And that's great. And you need to work together. But some people want another pond and they don't actually want you in it. And it's not a reflection on who you are or what you do, but some people just don't want to access that. And we have to give people choice and options. And so I think it's about, there has to be mutual respect and positive regard for everybody, and recognising that people bring different expertise.
Very much, Bron. Yen's asking, in a community in which stigma is attached to suicide in general, especially those with lived experience, and inside brackets, cared for or being bereaved by suicides, voices are hardly heard, what would you suggest prior to the inception of suicide prevention peer workforce? So what you suggest, I guess, in terms of preparation to start a conversation about that?
So can I just clarify, is it because of a lot of the prejudice and discrimination that people still experience around their lived experience, if they're wanting to have a conversation, how would they go about?
Yeah, if you wanted to introduce a peer workforce, how do you get that conversation started and move towards that?
Yeah, look, I think we know that lived experience is an enormous catalyst for change. There is so much research out there now, so much evidence that people with lived experience are asking for different types of support. So you can go, I would be raising the Compassion First report with people, highlighting the current most recent national recommendations that lived experience is at the front and centre of everything. So use those documents, because they are literally what Australia is now being guided by in suicide prevention. So use that, because that gives you the evidence. which a lot of people still want, but it is evidence informed by 3,000 plus people with lived experience. And then you can utilize your own lived experience in sharing the story and sharing what it is that you need. And that opens doors. And then I think it's about coming to every discussion with respect, with acknowledging that everyone's got a role, with an acknowledgement that you want to partner. It's not that you're coming in to criticise, but you're here to try and create something different and something that people need. And then having that compassionate curiosity to really understand where they're coming from, let them be heard, and then you be heard. And it's about, you've got to learn how to collaborate. But there is a lot of evidence there that you can point to, so you don't have to prove it anymore. It's there in black and white, and it's accepted nationally. And I would lead with that, and lead with your heart and your lived experience, and open up the conversation.
Great suggestions. Thank you. Kat's asking, with regards to training and support protocols for peer workers, either voluntary or paid, who would run these and what would be involved?
Look, I think the work that the National Suicide Prevention Office, in terms of developing a suicide prevention peer workforce strategy, is a start. I think there's, you've got all layers, haven't you? I mean, you need, when you're looking at safe spaces and what have you that are opening now and non-clinical, having very clear operational guidelines, protocols, and support in place for peer workers is really, it's imperative. But on an overarching, we do have the recent lived experience peer workforce guidelines that the National Mental Health Commission launched fairly recently. A lot of work, I think, has to be done in the suicide prevention space, though, because what currently exists still is quite mental health centric. And so I think there does need to be work done to look very specifically at the suicide prevention peer workforce, and out of that come the contextualised and specific standards and protocols and what have you that we need. But otherwise, I mean, it is happening in your safe spaces now, where they are really, through co-design, looking at what are the protocols that need to exist here so that we can be genuinely a no wrong door. How can we make sure that there is no exclusion criteria, and how can we best support anyone who walks in the door, ensuring their safety and the safety of the people who are working in the space. So lots of conversation, and there's lots to be learned, and there's lots of evaluation going on about it now. But there's absolutely proof on the ground that it can be done, and it is being done.
Thank you, Bronwen. One final question before we start wrapping up the session. This one's from Mark. In establishing this specific peer workforce, are there steps being taken that would see APRA or Medicare recognition of formal tertiary qualifications in the field of suicide prevention and suicidology? Currently, there is no specific mention of specialists in the area of suicide prevention, or suicidology.
To my knowledge, no. I'm not aware that any of that is in place at the moment. And I think we are in very, very early stages in the country around a suicide prevention peer workforce. There is starting to be, there's an acknowledgement that we need it at a national level, but at the moment the support and funding still, if anything is mentioned at a national level around peer workforce, it is still mentioned in the context of mental health. So, yeah, short answer to that is no, but I don't know how far away that would be.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. I really appreciate you today. Thank you so much for sharing all these useful resources and knowledge. And now I just want to give you the opportunity to say some closing words, recommendations, or resource sharing, or anything else you'd like to say before we end this session. So feel free to go to town.
Sorry, Pedro, can you just repeat that?
Did you lose? Didn't get it?
Yeah, I lost it. I lost you for like this blip, and I missed what you said.
That's okay. I was just saying we're going to wrap up the session now, but I want to give you the opportunity just to say some final words. So
there you go. And I was staring at you blankly. Look, I think the most important thing around the whole peer workforce is, from our perspective, I think we really need to stick to our path, in that having a suicide prevention peer workforce, I think, is going to be a real game changer. And But it's only going to happen if we continue to really look to collaborate, to integrate, to coexist with existing peer workforces, and to keep our minds open to the possibility of how we can have a paid suicide prevention peer workforce and a volunteer suicide prevention peer workforce work together well and really integrate, because I think it has this enormous potential to really supplement and complement so many services in suicide prevention and far broader, that I think could bring enormous change to the quality and impact of the support that's available for people. So yeah, early days, but then exciting to be part of something that's emerging as well. And we just all need to keep talking and keep learning from each other and keep pushing in the same direction. Thanks, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. Thank you, everybody who attended the session, asked great questions. We'll be back here in less than an hour with Carmen Bettridge, who will be talking about suicide prevention with tertiary students. Bronwen, have a great weekend and get some rest.
Thank you. Thanks, Pedro. Bye.